Well, it's very nice to be here for your sister Lorna and I at your young folks class. We don't sort of graduate for your age group these days, but it's many a time that we've been to your lovely meeting, and it's very nice to be able to speak tonight about the prophet Elijah and Elisha, because obviously one springs from the other. So that's what we've read from this particular chapter. I just want to for a moment show you how important these two people are. If we put our hand in 1 Kings 17 and then the other hand in, say, 2 Kings 8 or 9, the significance of these two prophets is that almost everything you've got between your two hands is Elijah and Elisha. And yet this says up the top there that this is about the kings, 1 Kings and 2 Kings. But in truth, the dominant characters are those two prophets. Now, if you look at any of the other passages in Kings and Chronicles, it's all about kings or queens. What that's telling us is that the two prophets, Elijah and Elisha, are obviously very important. And so much so that when they were there and operating, the spotlight of attention where things were happening, the movement of the times, was in the favour of the prophets. That's astounding, because it's nowhere else in the whole of the Kings and Chronicles. That's how significant Elijah and Elisha are. In every other section of Scripture of the record of the kings, it's the kings. That's why it's called Kings. But in this section, the prophets have absolute dominance. And sometimes one of the prophets is just saying to the king, if you want to come to me, knock on the door and I'll give you a message, but I don't come to the door. That's the prophet, his reaction to a king. Another time he just gives a message, realise it through his second in charge, so to speak, but it happens. The power is with the prophet. So it's a unique part of Scripture. I think that's very interesting to see, terribly interesting to see. At one passage here in Kings, I'm still coming out of the aeroplane a little bit, but we'll find a place. At one place here, in one chapter, there's 4 mentions of different kings. The 1 Kings chapter 20. And Ben-Hadad, the Syrian king, is warring against Israel, against Ahab. And verse 13 says this is what happened. And behold, there came a prophet unto Ahab, king of Israel. Well, I don't know who he was. I suppose we could say he's a friend of Elijah or Elisha. We don't know who he was. Verse 22 says much the same. And the prophet, I suppose it's the same one, the prophet came to the king of Israel and said, they've had one battle, and now what we're going to go, what happens from here is the next question. What about verse 28? Here's the next phase. It's determined by the prophet. And there came a man of God and spake unto the king of Israel and said, thus saith the Yahweh, because the Syrians, etc. Isn't that interesting? And there's another reference too, because it's in verse 35. A certain man of the sons of the prophets. Now there's a major event. There's 4 phases to it, and as you can see, every one of those phases is determined by a prophet. And you and I don't know who he was, got no idea who any of them were. But that's a feature of this section of the record of Kings and Chronicles. Makes it terribly interesting. So for that period of time in Israel, the word of God was a growing matter. There were people that were flowing to what we tend to call these days the schools of the prophets. So that's a very wonderful matter indeed. There was one of the chief men of Ahab's kingdom. In fact, it was his governor. And at one stage, he was looking after 100 prophets in a cave. And he was a prime minister. Ahab's prepared to destroy anything that belongs to God, including the prophet, if only he could catch him. And yet under his nose, his offsider, Obadiah, is actually feeding and caring 100 prophets. No scarcity, is it? That's unique. As you're going through the Kings and so forth and reading, you just keep that in mind. And you'll be quite astounded to see how refreshingly different this section of Scripture is as far as the Kings are concerned. In chapter 19 and verse 10, when he's down at Mount Sinai and he is attended to by the angel there, it says, "And he said, I have been very jealous for the Lord God of hosts, for the children of Israel have forsaken thy covenant, thrown down thine altars, and slain thy prophets. Thy covenant, thine altars, and thy prophets." So he brings it to God in the sense of, I'm looking after your affairs. I'm on your side. But they have forsaken thy covenant, thrown down thine altars, slain thy prophets, and I'm on your side. That's what Elijah's really saying to God. And it goes on to say, "And I, even I only," verse 10 again, "even I only am left. And they seek my life to take it away." Now when he said those words, there was 100 prophets in the vicinity of Ahab's kingdom. I'm not sure exactly where it was, but I mean, you can't feed 100 people, can you, unless you're fairly close to them. So I presume it was somewhere pretty close to Samaria, which was the capital where King Ahab was. And this Obadiah, he was looking after 100 men. Elijah says, I'm the only one left. What's that tell you about Elijah? He was not communicating very well at all, really, wasn't he? He wasn't really aware of what God was really doing. In fact, I would say that verse 10 is a bit rude, isn't it? That he should have said that about all the other people and said, look, I'm looking after your interests, your covenant, your altars, your prophets, you know. But he wasn't. He didn't even know really what was happening. So he'd gone all the way down to Mount Sinai to complain about that. And in verse 14 it says, "And he said," and this is his words again, "I have been very jealous for the Lord God of Israel, of hosts, because the children of Israel have forsaken thy covenants, thrown down thine altars, slain thy prophets with the sword, and I, even I only, am left." It's the same, isn't it? Verse 10, verse 14. Link them up so you never miss that point. That's pretty well telling God where to go, isn't it? And telling God what a great man he is against the folly and insufficiency of all the rest of the kingdoms. No one like me around. I don't know if you've ever read it like that, but that's really how it reads. He's very confident of his own standing with God, but of all the rest, he really hasn't got a good thing to say. Now I'll show you something very subtle. In the New Testament, that passage is quoted. It's in the New Testament in Romans chapter 11. Let's have a look at it, see what it says. In Romans chapter 11, a very famous chapter, all about the Jewish people. In the beginning of the chapter, and verse 2. Romans 11 verse 2. "God hath not cast away his people which he foreknew. Watch ye not what the scripture saith of Elijah, that should be. Doesn't look like it, but it is Elijah in the Greek. how he maketh intercession to God against Israel. And then it quotes what we've just been reading. Lord, they have killed thy prophets, dig down thine altars, I am left alone, and they seek my life. But notice what verse 2 finished off saying. How he maketh intercession to God against Israel. Underline that against, because it's true. It's absolutely true. Here's a prophet that's, at times, in this period of his life, did not really see what his mission was. He was good and able to tell people what to do, perhaps, or what they were doing was wrong, perhaps. But he wasn't really encouraging that community. He wasn't making himself related to what they needed. And so the Apostle Paul slips in the word against, because it was true. He was working against the nation, and that's how he describes the prophet's words in verse 10 and 14 of this chapter. So Elijah was not always a man of great manners, not always a man that saw the whole picture. He came upon the scene in blazing fury, as it were, threatening that there would be famine all over the land. Obviously, God had given him that power to do so. So in chapter 17, here he comes on the scene. 17 and verse 1. And Elijah the Tishbite, who was of the inhabitants of Gilead, that's right up on the northeast, over the Jordan River, in the hill country. He said unto Ahab, so he's speaking to the king. I don't know if he tapped on the door when he came in or not, or took his shoes, I don't know. But he suddenly, unexpectedly, come from nowhere, and he's talking to the king, who was of the inhabitants of Gilead, said unto Ahab the king, as the Lord God of Israel liveth, before whom I stand, there shall not be dew nor rain these years, but according to my word. My word. Have you ever noticed that? That's Elijah's word. He was able to say that because it was true, but it really wasn't a nice way to put it, was it? You know, I'm the boss around here, and I've come to tell you, the king, before whom he surely could have had a more decorous approach. But Elijah was to the point. The idolatry in Israel, in the northern kingdom, was very great. And a queen had come from the Sidonians, Jezebel, and she had filled the land with the worship of Baal. And so to have a prophet who was to the point and really made the case was very appropriate, obviously. That was God's choice. But he wasn't as mature a man, I think, at that stage, as later we will find him to be. Well, towards the end of that reading that we had in chapter 19, God says in verse 15, and the Lord said unto him, go, return on thy way to the wilderness of Damascus. Elijah, you're not really accomplishing anything here. You've run away from the job. He's down at Mount Sinai, which is a couple of 100 miles away from where the kingdom of Israel was, the kingdom of Ahab. What's he doing up there? Go, return on thy way to the wilderness of Damascus. The wilderness of what? Damascus is a foreign city. It's the capital of Syria. It's on the eastern side of Israel. This man doesn't want to go to Damascus. He would loathe Damascus. Absolutely loathe it. It must have been a great shock to him when the first thing that God says to him, I want you to go via Damascus. It would have been, the epitome of what he hated. Damascus was the capital of the Syrians, and the Syrians were Israel's major enemy. But what's he told to do? He's actually doing the absolute opposite of that, isn't he? 100% opposite. The Lord said unto him, go, return on thy way to the wilderness of Damascus. What happens then? And when thou comest, anoint Hazael to be king over Syria. Have you ever noticed that before? Of course you must have, because we read it every time we do the readings, don't we? But did you think that a prophet was sent to appoint a king of a foreign country? Verse 15 is a strange verse. It's unique in that respect. What God is saying to the prophet is, Elijah, I don't know what you think you're doing down here, but I've got the whole matter in my hand and in my purpose, and that's what I want you to get about. And it's an extensive program that actually will involve even what Gentile nations are doing, as well as Israel and Judah. And he concludes then with Israel and Judah, because the next verse is about Jehu the son of Nimshi shalt thou anoint to be king over Israel. That's the northern kingdom. Just put a little N there and that makes it all clear. And Elisha the son of Shaphat of Abel Maholah shalt thou anoint to be prophet in thy room. That's in the northern kingdom of Israel. So he's got the whole problem of the circumstances all looked after. And he's telling Elijah, I don't need you to make up the program. I've got it all under control. You're down here complaining about your own people. Get back there and do something to help them. I have the whole matter under control, whether it's the Gentiles, whether it's northern Israel, whether it's the prophets. That was a very powerful message, wasn't it? That's what that verse 16 is saying. Don't you tell me what I have to do, Elijah. I have your program sewn right up. It shall come to pass, verse 17, and they're all interconnected, so it's not a random plan. It shall come to pass that him that escapeth the sword of Hazael shall Jehu slay. Hazael was a king of the Syrians. I don't think Elijah had even begun to think about Hazael and the king of Syria. But that's the first thing mentioned. So it shall come to pass that him that escapeth the sword of Hazael, the king of Syria, shall Jehu slay. So Jehu's going to become the king of the northern kingdom. So this Jehu's going to come from somewhere, and he's going to become king and replace the line of Ahab. From the sword of Jehu shall Elisha slay. And then God says, effectively, get on your feet, Elijah. I have left me 7,000 in Israel, all the knees which have not bowed unto Baal, and every mouth which hath not kissed him. Now you know that Jeroboam made Israel to sin. And he did that when he put up two golden calves, didn't he? One was in the north and the other was close to the border with Judah. And that was under Jeroboam, who made Israel to sin. We all remember that phrase, don't we, in the record of Kings. But later, this Jezebel came from the Sidonian coast, and she was an exceedingly evil person. And when she came into Israel by marrying into the northern king who was Ahab, she brought with her another sense of idolatry, and that was Baal worship. And it was a highly sensual religion, highly. A bit like our world. Blatant about it, completely blatant and uncaring. Yeah, it would be a good comparison with what we have in our world. They couldn't care less, most, even authorities, in government sometimes, certainly in education department and so on. That's the new experience living in our 1920s in the democratic world. Well, she made her new religion extremely popular. And she had around her table when she had a meal 450 prophets of Baal. Can you see what an enormous progress she had made in such a short time? She was running the place. Ahab was scared stiff of her. Not the only husband like that, perhaps, but nevertheless, that's what he was. He had a very virile wife indeed. And Israel, therefore, in the northern part, had really now two false religions. There was that which Jeroboam brought in, about the golden calves. That was idolatry indeed. But now there was a much more virulent force of idolatry that had been established in the northern kingdom through Ahab and his wife Jezebel. So you can get the picture. So do you get the picture generally? Who's going to cure up that problem? And God says to Elijah, verse 18, "Yet have I left me 7,000 in Israel." Now where were they? Elijah's got the job of talking to them and teaching them. He doesn't even know their names. Doesn't know where they came from. Doesn't know where they are. He hasn't been involved with them. Or if he has, it's been a pretty coarse sort of contact that he's made. And in his assessment, he was doing all he could, and all the problem was with him. God loved his zeal. He really did love his zeal. And Elijah was an amazingly zealous man, prepared to do anything for the cause of God. But he had a lot to learn about how to preach to those people. And he hadn't developed that web of 7,000. If you had have said to him, "Elijah, tell me, some of these hundreds of people that are prophets," he couldn't have told you. And yet he's supposed to be the leading prophet of the times. That's a pretty impressive thing, isn't it, about Elijah's life? Really does open up the score dramatically. And you might have thought, well, if that's what he's like, God will leave him alone and that's it. Failure. But he didn't leave him alone. He called him here and he said, "Now listen, Elijah, I've got everything under control. Whether it's the Gentiles, whether it's northern Israel, whether it's the prophets. And I'll just tell you a secret. There's 7,000 of your kind that have never bowed the knee to Baal." That's Jezebel's line of worship. And he didn't know who they were. Do you ever sometimes feel that in our own circumstances that there's so many people that you really feel you should be spending time with that you wonder if you're really in connection with them? And you think of their circumstances and you think, "Oh, yeah, what have I done?" Sometimes you might even make a little note there on your pad and say, I'll try and ring so-and-so, or try and visit so-and-so, or try and have a chat to so-and-so. Not hard to make communications today, isn't it? But if we don't make any of those communications, we're in much the same sort of position. We can see they're in a risky situation and they're probably attending a lot of worldly things perhaps, or they're watching too much of this or that. But where are we? We can be Elijah-like in our own lives. We know what's right, and we love to have our company like we do tonight. We love to have our company. But there's people who aren't here tonight who perhaps could be. And what are we doing for them? I suppose a good thing is to make a little note and say, all right, well, tomorrow I will make a contact with Johnny or Jilly or whoever it might be who needs a bit more company and a bit of direct help in the walk in the truth. What an amazing thing that this dynamic man, Elijah, all the world's heard about Elijah, and yet there were 7,000 good, upright people following the laws of Yahweh, the God of Israel, and he didn't know who they were. Astounding. And yet one of them, Obadiah, that we mentioned before, the governor, the king's governor, he was looking after 100 people that were starving. You have to have a pretty good supply of food to do that. I think there must have been a lot going out of the royal kitchen, don't you? Just to supply food for 100 other people. But that's what he did, and they were prophets. Absolutely, Jezebel would have knocked their heads off in 2 seconds if she had have known. But she didn't know. No, governor was providing the food. Elijah didn't even know about Obadiah. When he did, he was kind of critical to him. Well, that's a very interesting background, isn't it? What obviously is needed is a teaching manner and teaching understanding. The zeal is wonderful. He was a remarkable man. But he fled down here because of Mount Carmel, and there God had shown who was God. And everybody saw it on the top of Mount Carmel. And then the rain came, didn't he? He ran before the chariot of Ahab. And he was a very bold man. He ran right back to the royal city of Jezreel, ahead of the horses in which the king was riding. And he ran before the horse. He was a fit man, very fit man, an enormous zeal. But when he got up there, and he thought the whole world was now coming sort of his way, because everybody had gathered from one end of Israel to the other to Mount Carmel and saw what happened, and he thought, right, they'll be converted straight away, but they weren't. And then he got a message from Her Majesty the Queen to say he's got 24 hours to live and I'll have his life. Where's the broad shoulders of Elijah now? He can't put his sandals on quick enough to go all the way down Israel, down to Mount Sinai, and there complain about all the others. Now, this is very dramatic, isn't it? When you put it in real life, it really is very dramatic. This man is exceptionally powered, exceptionally so, but he's not always as courageous as we may think, and neither are we. We make many mistakes when we're even trying to do the right things, and so we need to be aware of our own faults before we are quick to point out the faults of others. So he's given these three commissions, A, B, and C, verse 15, 16, and 17. Do you know that he never did two of them? The only one he ever did was appoint Elisha. That's the third one mentioned. See verse 16. He didn't anoint Jehu. He didn't anoint the king of Syria in Damascus. He didn't do that. The only one of those three things that he did was that he appointed Elisha as taking his position. Well, to become at least an apprentice, as it were, living in a town called Abel-Meholah. I'll just tell you where Abel-Meholah is. There's the River Jordan running down. About halfway, there's a lovely little grassy area. It's called Abel-Meholah, and it means the meadow of pastures. I suppose that really meant it's good country. Country alongside a river normally is good country. And there was a man called Elisha, the son of Shaphat, of Abel-Meholah. Do you think that Elijah knew him? I don't think he did. I could be wrong. But it seems to me that if he didn't know any of the 7,000, then this man would be one of them. Which makes it a very interesting record when you come now to verse 19, where it says, So he departed thence and found Elisha the son of Shaphat, who was ploughing with 12 yoke of oxen before him, and he with the 12th. This is the first thing we hear about Elisha. Elisha means the salvation of Yah. Elijah means, my God is Yahweh. That was the cry that came up from Mount Carmel when the offerings were accepted by God. Now, that's a long way away. Carmel's way over here on the west, on the coast, and Abel-Meholah is right up alongside the River Jordan over here. So it's just a long way away, isn't it? You wonder if Elisha was at Carmel, don't you? If anyone that had any zeal or interest in the things of God, if they had any of that, they would have been at Carmel, wouldn't they? This was an absolute setup. It was a challenge between the living God of Israel and the religion which Jezebel had brought into their country. If you had any spark of interest in the truth, you'd be there. But I don't know if Elisha was. He's right over here and he's by himself. In fact, he's a farmer. And he's very diligently employed with his father's business. It's a pretty good business. It says in verse 19 that he was ploughing with 12 yoke of oxen before him, and he with the 12th. So he was, if you see those drawings and pictures of former days, the farmer would have a number of horses, and he'd be behind them, and he'd be directing them and trying to keep the hoe in a stable position, and driving them a bit faster than they probably wanted to go. And he was diligent. It says that there was 12 yoke of oxen. So if they were in pairs, then that means that there might have been 24 of them. A pair of oxen would be like a tractor for a modern farmer. An equivalent, you might say. So Elisha was not from a poor family at all. His dad had a lot of ground. It was down there close to the River Jordan, and that was looked upon as, pretty close to the Gentile lands. And it was isolated. I remember coming down through that valley with Lorna, and all of a sudden, lo and behold, we have a puncture in this little hired car. There wasn't any doubt about it. We couldn't go any further. I didn't like it, because over here, about 20 or 30 yards, there was a big fence. And that was Jordan, the country of Jordan at that time, just over, well, it was this side of the river at that point. And I didn't like the fact that we were completely isolated by ourselves, didn't know who to go or where to go, and we had a flat tire, and you can't blow them up, can you? No, very uncomfortable, very isolated. That was where Elisha was brought up. But it must have been a piece of good ground, because he's using it for his father's work. And when Elijah comes, it says, verse 19, he departed thence and found Elisha, the son of Shaphat, who was ploughing with 12 yoke of oxen, and he with the 12th. And Elijah passed by him and said, "Good morning, I've got a message for you. Do you mind interrupting what you're doing?" He didn't say anything. He didn't say a word. As rude as you like. He just put his mantle over him. Passed by, sort of went past him almost, and a sort of last shot, he flicks out his mantle over him. Not a word of explanation. And yet God had told him to do that. Not like that, but had told him to anoint the prophet Elisha to be his assistant. Well, what an introduction. Would you be inclined to follow a boss that just ran past you on the footpath and flung, some little message in front of you and just went on, never said a word? That's extremely rude, isn't it? To say the least. And wasn't it a huge offer of a huge nature? Elijah was an extremely important person in Israel, and God was doing great things with him. He was able to turn on a drought, and it was for 3.5 years. Imagine how that kingdom was reeling with anger about Elijah, because they had no rain for 3.5 years. How do people live? Elijah was a very powerful man. Couldn't he at least thought, well, I've got to employ a young man, and he lives in this isolated circumstance, and he's out there working on the field, so he's in with the business, he's in with the growing of things, and that's his people are in the house there, his father and mother, probably grandma and grandpa. It was a pretty place. The very name of the place indicated that. He's not going to find it easy to drop all that. Of course he wouldn't. But all Elijah did was throw his coat over him. Do you think we're exaggerating? I don't think we are. The details are crisp and clear. That's exactly what he did. "Let me, I pray thee, kiss my father," says Elisha. and my mother. That's pretty basic, isn't it? If you're leaving their house, you don't just go out the back door, do you? You let your parents know what you're doing. That's what we should do. Almost everybody does do that. But that's just because you want to run down the street and get your bike fixed up or buy something down the shop. This is a huge opportunity that's being placed upon another. Huge. 30 pages of the Bible are going to be taken up by the life of this man, Elijah and Elisha. That's how big it is. And he hasn't even got the courtesy to explain the position to his new appointee. And kiss my mother and my father, and then I will follow thee. By the way, do you always kiss your mother or your father when you leave? Eh? I can tell you that mothers and fathers don't like their children just going out of the house willy-nilly on their terms. It's not good either, is it? Sometimes they get into problems because they haven't chatted it over with mum and dad. Don't do that. Make sure that your relationship with your mum and dad is close and that you're able to talk to them about your life. And then when you really need someone, guess who'll be there? And that's what mothers and fathers are happy to do. But the least we can do when we're younger is at least to have good manners towards our parents. At the table, wherever. We've finished our meal and we're a boy and we can gobble down a meal in 5 seconds, as we could in those days and we can't now. But you get, therefore, to be finished with your meal much earlier, probably a sister who's still going along fairly slowly. And sometimes you can think, I don't want to waste time around here anymore. I'll nick off to my room. Don't do that. It's a family. You're part of it. Mum and Dad have been working during the day to provide in different ways. You're part of that family. And it says something too about Elisha, doesn't it? He wouldn't do that. He thought it was plain rude. Please let me at least go back and speak to my mum and dad and explain what's happening. It was a complete shock to him. He didn't get an email through the post, 2 weeks before or 2 months before, did he? He got about 2 seconds and this cloth was thrown over him and the next minute his employee's on the way. Just expects that he'll just keep going with him. It was really very rude when you think about it. Let's make sure that we keep our own manners in our family life. So it says in verse 20, he left the oxen. Amazing. And ran after Elijah and said, let me, I pray thee, kiss my father and my mother. We thought, well, he's going with Elijah, but he wasn't quite, see? His sense of what was right was so strong about his parents, notice that even when this principle of the prophet spoke to him in this way, this glib way, he repealed, he sort of went, partnered them with him and said, look, just a minute, I want to talk to mum and dad, I haven't even explained anything to them. Hey, you don't talk to Elijah like that, do you? But he did. Tells us something about Elisha, doesn't it? The two characters sort of just formed straight out in front of us like that. One's on with the job, got no personality with it necessarily, was sort of get this job done, After that it's Hazael and after that it's something else. And so, young man, come. He didn't even say that. Didn't say young man, didn't say anything. Just threw this over him. You might say, well, he might have thought that he was a funny old man. Well, Elijah did look like an unusual man, didn't he? Remember, he had a huge amount of hair. And when Elisha came along, the contrast was so great that some young boys threw off at Elisha and called him a barehead. He was bald-headed. The contrast, of course, was with Elijah because he had so much hair. That's why it's put that way. So these young hooligans, they thought that they could have a sling-off at the prophet by calling him bald head in contrast with Elijah. Well, what's Elisha going to do? He's now between his parents and the house. No doubt it was a nice home because this was a family in pretty good position. If you saw a farmer that had half a dozen tractors, you'd think, well, he's doing pretty well, isn't he? This man's got the equivalent of about 12 tractors. And he's obviously the leading son. He's out there administering the property. And he's just appealed that he be able to see his mother and his father. And so Elijah does say at the end of verse 20, brief, go back again. For what have I done to thee? Well, he did. He could be spoken to. And he did respond. But again, it's pretty short. And he returned, verse 21, he returned back from him and took a yoke of oxen and slew them. When it says he returned back, it means he went back to where he had been, because he had something else in mind and he was going to do it. Elijah or not, he was going to do it. He returned back from him and took a yoke of oxen and slew them. That doesn't take 5 minutes. That would be a long time to slay a yoke of oxen. How many was in a yoke? It might have been 2, it might have been more. Until you tie them up, doesn't it? And slew them. That's not 5 minutes either. Big animals, huge amounts of muscle and blood. It's a really big job. I've had to do that once, and I tell you, it's a big thing to burn an animal. A big calf, not a calf, but a big cow. To burn that takes hours. It's a big thing to do. Well, he took a yoke of oxen. I suppose he had a few of the family servants around, I suppose. Never mind. It was a big operation. And slew them. Any volunteers? You've got to take the head off. Got to get rid of their legs. Chop them all up. That's a big thing, isn't it? We just read it as a stroke, but it's really a big operation. And boiled their flesh. Where are you going to get the wood for that? You won't get very big trees of wood down in the Jordan Valley. But he wanted to boil their flesh. And so do you know what he did? He got hold of all the instruments that were needed to get this group of oxen into shape, like we do. Like people did always until fairly recently, when they had all these animals, they had to get them in order. So there was crossboards and so on to keep them in order. And he got all of that, plus the wagon, I suppose. And you can't pull a wagon apart in 5 minutes either, can you? So what's it reasonable? Is there 2 or 3 hours involved with work in there? I think there is. At least 2 or 3 hours. What do you think Elijah's doing? As Elisha was doing all of that, and I think it would have been all of that time. Not only that, but there was his mother over there and she was in tears. She was losing her son, her dad, his dad, who thought that this was going to be the boy that would make the property work, and he would have somebody to take over from where he was. But he could see that his mind now was to go with Elisha, to go with Elijah and be about his work. So he put all that together and gave unto the people, and they did eat. The people. Who's the people? I suppose all the neighbours came. If he had some servants, then they must have had homes relatively close. And so he's invited them all to come, and they have a party of for departure to not celebrate, that's the wrong word, but to express their appreciation of young Elijah, young Elisha. Now, what's that tell you about Elisha? You put those details together. It tells you a lot, doesn't it, really? Firstly, he was well brought up. He had a good relationship with his mother and his father. He wanted to do what the senior prophet asked him to do, and it was represented in this coat, which was representative of the prophet's position. He wasn't disrespectful to that. He wasn't saying he wouldn't do it at all. But he also wanted to make sure that he wouldn't retreat on what he's doing. Hey, that's pretty cluey, isn't it? He's talking to Elijah, who's run all the way down to Mount Sinai to get away from his job. But Elisha says, I want to go and burn my present job. And then I will go to the prophet and serve him all my life. And so he burns what was making for him a pretty good salary in very comfortable circumstances. He consumes it right down to the last animal, the last bit of wood that was there. He did all of that because he wasn't coming back. That makes us think, doesn't it? What sort of character of Elisha have you and I got? We're so often in our present ecclesial life, my dear young people, you fear of this one or that one that's not coming along to young folks anymore. You know, the sort of thing. Or someone that's got somebody outside of the truth and they're going off in their ways. Sometimes we have to burn something and just say, no, I'm not coming back. I've made a decision, I've been baptized, and that was a commitment for life, and that's where I'm going. I hope that's how we all feel. Because the person alongside you needs your company and you need theirs. And when you hear that, and it was so in my day to a degree, but it's more now because of the world we're in, it does weaken your own zeal and enthusiasm towards the things of the truth. And we need to be more aware of that than ever. If you've got friends in the young folks group at Sunday school, make the most of it. Do all you can to encourage that relationship. If there's somebody that you know that would like to come, make sure you inspire them to come. And show them why the truth is the greatest thing we can have. Serving God here in this time, the greatest thing you could do was what Elisha did. And there was a pile of ashes. That's all that was left. His employment was gone. He had the cape that was tossed him, and he went with that cape. It says at the end of it, then he arose. Then, underline that little word, then. There's about 4 or 5 hours involved in that then. He left his mother and father, wiped their tears, put it all together, packed his little bag, put on the coat which had been given him by the prophet, and went after Elijah and ministered unto him. So the boy of district popularity, they all came, then all the people around about all came. That wouldn't happen because a person's leaving the district, would it? Well, it would if you admired him, and he obviously was admired. No doubt his good qualities were known all around the Abel Mahola, as it's called. And they were watching him go. And they're going to, boy, they thought, oh, he's going to be great. Our ecclesia is going to really be benefited by him later on. But he's going off with the prophet. And he's not coming back. He's left a pile of ashes. His old job's gone. He's a new man in his new calling. Now, chapter 20 is nothing to do with that. The call of Elisha, how long have we got, pal? 5 minutes, 10 minutes? About that? Okay. We have to say goodbye to our parents. But chapter 20's got nothing to do with it. It's about the king of Syria. See, he didn't go via Damascus at all, did he? He's gone and anointed Elisha, but he hasn't done anything with Syria. He was told to go through Damascus, and if he was coming from Mount Sinai to Damascus, Damascus is on the other side of the River Jordan, then he would have come up on that side straight and gone to Damascus. But he didn't. He didn't do that. First person he went to was this Elisha. What an amazing record it is. And it's in this chapter where Ben-Hadad of Syria, he takes on Ahab. And that's where we saw those 4 prophets. Remember we pointed out those 4 prophets in this chapter? They're all in this chapter. What's that saying? Elijah, there's a lot of work being done. And there are schools of prophets. I don't say that each one of these represented 40, 50 people. I don't think that's true. That comes later. But it does say that when God said there's 7,000 that have not bowed the knee, this 4 here, if it was 4, it might have been 3. But these ones would be in that 7,000. And there were lots and lots of others. There was a big work to be done, wasn't there? Sometimes in ecclesial life, it's not just what you and I want to do, it's what needs to be done that we need to think. There might be something you're really, really good at. And that's good. And we have talents which are rightly used, appropriate to what talents we might have. But there are some things that you probably don't feel like doing. Well, have a go at it and see if you can do something to help a situation which is needed. These 4, they just came out of nowhere. And they dictated the terms. It wasn't really up to Ahab. It wasn't up to Ben-Hadad. As a matter of fact, Ahab won the first battle. Imagine that. And when he was sort of on top of everything, the next visit came from the prophet. And then he started to boast about that, and down he went. And eventually, of course, Ben-Hadad defeated him. So there were lots of things that were happening that didn't necessarily involve Elijah. When we come to chapter 21, we all know that story. It's about Naboth and his vineyard. Naboth the Jezreelite. Jezreelite means he comes from Jezreel, and that's the higher end of the hills of Israel. It's a long way north, and the king, Ahab, he wanted a plot of land there. In total contrast to Elijah and Elisha, this man destroyed a good man because he wanted a plot of land which he wasn't supposed to have. And it's not till you come over to 2 Kings 1 that you pick up the story of Elijah and Elisha again. And in this 2 Kings chapter 1, that just then followed through with chapter 2. So if we come to 2 Kings chapter 2, just briefly, it says, "It came to pass when the Lord would take up Elijah unto heaven by a whirlwind, that Elijah went with Elisha from Gilgal." Now I just want to sketch a scene that's found from the next few verses. God has said to Elijah, there's 7,000 that have not bowed the knee. You're not attending to them. You haven't been really attending to them. But you know, in this chapter, there's groups of 50 prophets as a group. You know, whether it's Gilgal or Bethel or Jericho or Jordan, there's whole groups of prophets, and they're building houses. What's happened? Elisha is out there, and Elijah. And this is the time when the school of prophets was really developed. You never have clusters like that. Sometimes you'll have a person that's described as a prophet, and he was the son of prophets. They seem to sort of go in families. I suppose it's a very strong upbringing, and they learnt a very selfless life in the environment of their family and their convictions. And thus they became sons of the prophets. You know how that term's used in the scriptures, sons of the prophets? It was in family runs that they were developed. But I call it a thrill is to see that in this chapter you've got whole groups of them in those 4 cities that we just mentioned. I don't know about all the other cities, but obviously there was a very real success story. Who else had learned his lesson? Elijah's learned his lesson, hasn't he? Elijah obviously was involved in that work. And it's a testimony to his work that back there in chapter 20, where those 4 incidental prophets turned out, and this chapter tells us that Elijah had responded to what God had helped. And it probably also is telling us that Elisha was a very good learner, and he was very good at the same work. So much so that when you come to the New Testament, in Luke chapter 1, this comes right out of the blue. Their work was never forgotten. In Luke chapter 1 and verse 16, this is talking about John the Baptist. He was the forerunner for Christ. It was like the prophet that went ahead of Christ. And it says of him, he shall be great. Verse 15, in the sight of the Lord, and shall drink neither wine nor strong drink. And he shall be filled with the Holy Spirit. Dedicated. The rest of his life was a heap of ashes. Even from his mother's womb, he never had a period in his life where he went off in another way. And many of the children of Israel shall he turn to the Lord their God. That's what we've been talking about all night, isn't it? Our young folks group, the group of young people in this district, the group in this province, the group in Canada, group in North America. There's many of them that are having all sorts of difficulties. And you probably know that better than I do. It does grieve me, though, to see young people brought up in good homes and they've become loose to lots of things. And you know that and I know it. But what we've got to do is something about it. It's no good just saying we know it. We've got to do something about that and cause them to know that we know the best thing for them is the truth of God. It can't be anything better, can there? Ever thought of that? What could be better than knowing the truth? If you don't know the truth, what are you doing? You're a failure, aren't you? In as far as the human being is concerned. That's the truth of it. Death awaits that person. To have the truth of God is the greatest thing. Nothing else is true than that. So when we have young people growing through and they're in their 13s and 14s, you older ones, you speak to them, please, and get to know them. Let them know that you really are interested in them. Do you remember, I still remember, older people in my meeting when I was 10 and 11 and 12 and 13 who took an interest in me when we did our examinations, the public examinations, and so it'd be published in the paper. Some of our older brothers and sisters in the Adelaide Ecclesia would ring me up every year when that happened because they'd see your results in the paper. I haven't ever forgotten that. It just told me that busy people with their own families and so on nevertheless took an interest in me. I didn't deserve it, I can tell you. I was no angel. It's just about none of my confreres are here to testify how true that is. But I really do remember that to this day. That there were lots of people who took an interest in my life and that of my brother and sister and many other young people. And consequently, when we had opportunity to have some really remarkable people in teaching, they were there. And there was a group of people that were able to respond together and really build something that was extremely helpful for me and many others. It says here in verse 16, many of the children of Israel shall he turn to the Lord their God. That's a commission for all of us. You can put that robe on tonight to turn many of our young people in this meeting and others to turn them to the Lord their God, to the Spirit of the truth. And verse 17 says, and he shall go before him, speaking of John the Baptist, he shall go before him in the spirit and power of Elijah, and turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, and the disobedient to the wisdom of the just. That's Elijah. You and I might not have thought that would be written in the Bible like that. But it's because we were able to see that that is what Elijah did. It wasn't all just up in Mount Carmel. Fair enough, that was wonderful what happened in Mount Carmel. Fire came down from God and licked up the offerings. Wonderful, fantastic, great to be there. You might feel like Elijah, who thought, look, I feel full of enthusiasm. He even raced the horses back to Jezreel. He was some runner, wasn't he? Amazing. God gave him, no doubt, the strength to do that. But that tells you that that was his long-standing work, to develop that group of prophets in Israel and the good, so that for his life and Elisha's life, the kings and great men of Judah and Israel, during that period of time, they were overshadowed by the work of the truth in Israel. It wasn't the kings that got the record. It was these two prophets and the work that they did. And they established a period in Israel which was very famous indeed. Let's take it to heart, see if we can build our young folks group and make sure that no one's leaving it behind. Nice to be with you. Thank you.